General Motors, or GM, once ruled the world. Now its name is scrap. It wasn't just a car company, it was America on wheels, fueling jobs, pride, and identity. But behind the chrome and gleaming bodywork, rust had already set in. How did the most powerful automaker on Earth lose control of its own brand and its future? In this episode of the Infographics Show, we investigate the real reason GM failed. So how did GM go from leading the pack to bankruptcy? Well, in 2005, profits plunged nearly 90%. By 2007, GM's market share had fallen to 23%, and just 2 years later it hit 19%, the lowest in company history. It seemed like GM got a little too comfortable with its success. Executives saw high sales of Cadillacs and Chevys in the 50s and 60s, and then just kind of kicked back and relaxed. That arrogance didn't come out of nowhere, it was built on decades of dominance. GM was founded in 1908 in Flint, Michigan. It eventually became one of the most iconic American car brands, and brands in general. It's hard to overstate just how important GM was. At one point, it employed 1 in 200 Americans. The company's revenue equaled 3% of the U.S.'s total GDP. So when GM said the classic phrase, "What's good for GM is good for America," they weren't exaggerating. The company produced Chevrolets, Cadillacs, and Buicks, some of the most famous classic American muscle cars. And if movies are to be believed, it's where most baby boomers were conceived. In the 1950s, GM's market share in the U.S. was 46%. The company was absolutely dominating U.S. car manufacturing. GM wasn't just big, it was pioneering. In 1939, it launched the world's first car with an automatic transmission, the GM Hydra-Matic. Power steering, power brakes, and independent suspension, also GM innovations. The first cars you could park without working out your arm muscles. It was also the first auto company to update its models' features and styling almost every year. This got Americans started on the trend of replacing their cars every few years or so to keep up with the Joneses. Of course, this trend would also help cause GM's undoing, but more on that later in the video. But the American car market changed over time. Different preferences emerged. Gas prices increased. The rest of the industry kept innovating, and GM, it wasn't doing so much. So the first major problem with GM, the cars themselves. The OPEC oil embargo in 1973 and 74 was the beginning of the brand's real troubles. And not only because it increased gas prices, it led to a sudden, very intense awareness that too much reliance on gas and oil, especially from foreign sources, was a bit of an issue for the U.S. In 1975, corporate average fuel economy standards, known as CAFE for short, were enacted in response. To reduce the presence of gas-guzzling cars and foreign oil reliance, the U.S. government required car manufacturers to meet specific miles per gallon targets and cut energy consumption, all while reducing emissions to protect the planet and people's lungs. And GM was way below the new targets. The company would need to hit 18 miles per gallon by 1978, just 3 years away. Today, that might not sound too bad. In 2020, the average fuel economy for new vehicles was about 25 miles per gallon. But back then, American cars were gas-hungry beasts. A Cadillac could barely squeeze 14 miles per gallon on the highway, and Buicks or Pontiacs weren't much better. Hitting that new standard would mean redesigning nearly everything under the hood. Meanwhile, fast-selling international cars like the Toyota Corolla were already going farther on less, over 30 miles per gallon on the highway. And as American drivers sat in endless gas station lines, prices kept climbing thanks to the oil embargo. No one wanted to fill up every other day just to watch their money burn away. GM's car sales immediately nosedived. In 1973 alone, the company laid off 86,000 workers, 38,000 of them for good. That was about 6% of its entire workforce, gone almost overnight. In the first quarter of 1974, sales were already down 20.6% year over year. In less than a year, GM lost its crown as the most profitable industrial corporation in the U.S., replaced, predictably, by the Exxon Corporation, which was making it rain with their gas profits. To reduce the number of unsold big cars they had on standby, GM decided to convert more production to its smaller models, which were still popular. But that had never been the bread and butter of GM's business model or reputation among car makers. So even with this transition, it was still making fewer smaller cars than arch-rival Ford. The oil embargo was eventually lifted, and GM's sales rebounded somewhat. In 1975, the company's sales went up, but only by 1.4%, because GM hadn't fixed their underlying problem. The era of block-long muscle cars was over. U.S. consumers wanted something different, and GM wasn't listening. In the 1970s and 1980s, Japanese car manufacturers were seeing major success in the international market. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan, among other companies, were producing exactly the kinds of cars people needed. At a time of high oil prices and increasing urbanization, compact, fuel-efficient cars were becoming all the rage. Meanwhile, GM clung to its bigger is better philosophy long after American drivers had moved on. Sure, some people still kept an old Camaro or muscle car in the garage, taking it out on the weekends, but those vehicles were becoming more and more impractical for everyday use. All the way back in 1993, auto industry analyst Marianne Keller said of GM that the company had an almost pathological resistance to the glaring shifts in American life and values, and how those changes might translate into automobile purchases. People wanted pickups, minivans, and compact SUVs, cars that looked modern and felt efficient, sleeker designs, better features, smarter tech. Ironically, GM had created that hunger for something new, but now it couldn't keep up with it. Nowhere is the tone deafness of GM more apparent than in the collapse of its mid-level luxury brand Buick. In 1984, GM sold almost 1 million Buicks domestically. By 2005, with an even larger population to sell to, that number had dropped to just 282,000, a 70% plunge. Buick went from a household name to the biggest sales decline of any car brand in America. And no wonder, Buick's designs had been stale and outdated for a while. They didn't even start offering SUVs until 2002. Foreign automakers had already been beating GM for years on small fuel-efficient cars. Then, by the late 1980s, brands like Lexus and Infiniti, the luxury arms of Toyota and Nissan, came for GM's high-end market too, crushing its so-called luxury image. Other international luxury brands like BMW were also rising fast in popularity. GM, unfortunately, continued to be asleep at the wheel. Back in the mid-1980s, research firms like Vista Group were warning GM that European and Japanese rivals were about to leave them in the dust. The report pointed out that GM needed to make fewer but more luxurious cars with smoother handling and sleeker designs. Vista Group's report sounds almost apocalyptic when it comes to GM's fortunes, stating the sounds of heavy armor can be heard in the suburbs in what may be the last assault on General Motors' longtime stronghold, the luxury car market. Short of screaming, Toyota and Honda are at the gates of the castle, we don't know what else those research firms could have done to warn GM. And the company's response? Dan Gorell, then VP of Strategic Vision, a market research firm that worked for GM, said, "I remember being told by a GM executive that they had never worried about Buick because as people got older and richer, they would get fatter and they would always buy Buicks to sit in them." That didn't turn out to be the solid business strategy that GM executives hoped it would be, which leads us to the next basic problem with the company. Its entire business model contributed to its collapse. First off, there is the complete disconnect between management and their customers, and their employees, and their cars, and everything management should be overseeing, honestly. The problem has existed for decades. One finance executive who quit out of sheer frustration in 1987, Nancy Rotering, explained the attitude at headquarters was, "We're GM, we know everything, we don't need to change." When we say executives were disconnected from the rest of their company, we mean that in a literal physical way. In GM's Detroit headquarters, executives worked on the 14th floor, separated by double electronic doors from the rest of the company. They had their own private basement garage, from which they could connect immediately to the executive floor. Even meals were taken in private dining rooms. Never mind customers, they rarely even interacted with their own dealers, people who would be well-positioned to tell them about customer preferences and dislikes. So as the company spiraled downwards financially, they remained completely out of touch about the existing problems and potential solutions. Unfortunately, one common-sense solution also seemed especially off-limits to GM, because when times are tough, most companies cut costs to accommodate them. But GM couldn't, because a lot of the company's costs were fixed. To start with, GM was by far the biggest of the big three automakers. In 2005, it still had around 335,000 employees, more than Ford's 300,000, and that was after decades of layoffs. At its peak, GM's global workforce topped 800,000. So when the US auto market started tanking around 2005, GM was hit the hardest. Its massive pension plans and retiree healthcare costs were far heavier than its competitors. And because of strict union contracts, even shutting down plants didn't save as much money as it should have. The problem went back decades. In the 70s and 80s, when sales fell and GM tried to shrink, the United Auto Workers refused to renegotiate health benefits, not just for current members, but for nearly 400,000 retirees. Those benefits alone added about $1,200 to the cost of every car GM built. After losing $4 billion in 2005, GM announced 30,000 job cuts and plans to close 9 North American plants by 2008. But the United Auto Workers, or UAW, had job security clauses in their contracts, meaning laid-off workers still got partial pay and benefits for a while. Even when GM tried to slim down, it was still bleeding money. When union reps were asked what GM could be focused on instead, UAW local president Mike O'Rourke said they need to design cars that sell, which is fair. Union contracts aside though, GM's own business model was a train wreck. One Harvard MBA alumni pointed out that the model is fragmented and decentralized. Different departments and brands used completely different systems and processes to accomplish their daily tasks. This included tasks as mundane as filing expense reports, paying vendors, and onboarding employees. So while GM was paying the costs for its incredibly large size as a company, it wasn't taking advantage of economies of scale as much as it could have. Each brand had individual contracts for services and indirect materials instead. When GM tried to change this company culture by consolidating back-office operations, most business units didn't want to. All of that had a huge effect on GM's profitability. In 2014, its earnings before interest and taxes, or EBIT, was around 8%. Toyota's EBIT, 15.5%. This also left fewer dollars to invest in design and innovation, perpetuating the problem of outdated, inefficient cars that weren't appealing to most consumers. Not to mention, the business model that originally worked well for GM ended up turning against it as the company had to get smaller and more efficient, against more and more competitors. GM used to pride itself on having several brands for several different kinds of consumers. Alfred Sloan, who ran the company from 1912 to 1956, wanted GM to supply cars for every purse and purpose. One executive defined the company's brands as Chevrolet for the hoi polloi, Pontiac for the poor but proud, Oldsmobile for the comfortable but discreet, Buick for the striving, and Cadillac for the rich. In other words, each brand appealed to a different market segment, increasing the company's market saturation, which is why over half of all cars on U.S. roads in the 1950s were made by GM. But as the company faced competition and changing consumer preferences, they had to both downsize and change their cars to appeal to what consumers wanted, which means that car sales from one division often cannibalize sales of others. GM also used an in-house auto parts maker. It was part of the company's strategy to have complete vertical integration. So not only would customers get their car needs for every person purpose met at GM, they would get all of their parts and replacement parts from the company as well. But most competitors had started outsourcing their parts to contracts since the 1970s. Competition for the contracts meant companies like Toyota could rely on cheaper parts, usually made equally well if not better than what GM was producing in-house. GM didn't catch up to this strategy until 1999, when it spun off its parts maker Delphi into a separate company and finally started to seek out cheaper parts makers globally. This summed up GM's biggest problem: it stopped being competitive. The company ignored market trends and industry shifts, always reacting years, sometimes decades too late. Lastly, GM has faced a couple of scandalous reveals of defects among its vehicles, which did nothing to help its reputation. In a response to a flood of international front-wheel drive cars that were outcompeting many U.S. automakers, GM decided to do its own version. They were going to respond to consumer demand. So, in the late 1970s, GM started the X-Car project, which was such a complete and utter disaster that the U.S. government had to get involved. The X-Cars were meant to be developed as quickly as possible to reverse GM's crumbling market share. They were also going to be given to 4 GM brands: Chevrolet, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Pontiac, under different names, obviously. Since the car would be shared across 4 divisions and needed to reach the market fast, GM decided those divisions should collaborate on its design and engineering. While teamwork sounds great in theory, anyone who has done a group project with people you have never worked with before can testify that things don't always go as planned. When Pontiac is building a rear suspension and Chevrolet is building the front, it might not come together so well. And weirdly enough, testing a whole new car design and build in the shortest time possible didn't work out so great. At first, it seemed like a success. Reviewers gave the X-Body models stellar reviews, but the models they were testing were hand-assembled, non-production spec models that GM had taken extra care to perfect. Customers would not be so lucky. So the X-Body had fantastic sales numbers upon debut. At last, an American-made car that could compete with the international brands. The Chevrolet's X-Body model alone, the Citation, sold 800,000 units in 1980. But things quickly turned sour. Within the first year, drivers started noticing rust on their new cars. The interiors began quite literally falling apart. Bolts clattered to the floor, trims came loose mid-trip, and buyers started to wonder if their cars were even safe. The problem that would lead to a lawsuit by the US government, though, was an issue with the brakes. You can deal with the trim hanging off the inside of your car, but brakes? You really need those to work. And unfortunately for many of GM's X-Body cars, they didn't. They hastily engineered the brakes of this new model type that often led to rear wheels of the car locking, especially when drivers engaged in sudden or heavy braking. This led to thousands of complaints, not to mention accidents and even deaths on the road. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA, pushed GM to issue a recall. Instead of taking responsibility, GM took a more toddler-like approach to the problem, refusing to recognize the issue and take ownership. After a lot of pressure, they eventually held a somewhat secret and voluntary-only recall of almost 47,000 of the cars they sold to see if they could fix the brakes. A second voluntary recall was issued in 1983, but by that time consumers had had enough, as had the US government. The Justice Department filed a lawsuit against GM for, indirectly causing the deaths of at least hundreds of Americans and injuries of many more. By 1987, GM did get the lawsuit dismissed, but the many complaints coupled with the government lawsuit had put an irreversible strain on not only the X-Body models, but the company itself. People like cars with functional brakes, it turns out. The defects, the lawsuit, and GM's horrible handling of the whole situation helped quicken the collapse of the auto giant, and unfortunately that wouldn't be the last scandal to plague GM's cars. In 2014, it was revealed that not only did several GM car models have faulty ignition switches, but the company had actually covered it up. The corporate cover-up led to at least 120 deaths of GM consumers. This was after the company had received $49.5 billion in bailout funds from the US government through TARP, Troubled Asset and Relief Program, in 2008. It was part of a wider $80 billion American auto industry bailout, of which GM received the lion's share of support. While it did save around 1.5 million jobs according to the Center for Automotive Research, it also cost the taxpayers a lot. By the time the US government sold off the shares it had acquired for its bailout, it still had an overall loss of $11.2 billion. GM messing up so badly after being bailed out by the public really didn't help its perception or reputation. However, to her credit, the company's relatively new CEO, Mary Barra, handled the public scandal relatively well, to the point where GM was able to recover and experience record sales in 2014 to 2016. So all may not be lost. As of 2024, GM President Mark Reuss unveiled the company's new Winning with Simplicity strategy. It aims to address a lot of GM's inefficiencies, namely by eliminating over 2,700 unique parts from its vehicles. According to Reuss, this will improve supply chain efficiency, shorten the manufacturing process, and lower costs. In Q3 of 2025, GM also beat Wall Street expectations when it came to profits, by a lot. The company received $49 billion in revenue during the year's third quarter. Analysts had estimated only $45.3 billion in earnings. Adjusted EBIT, which had been expected to range from $10 billion to $12.5 billion, was raised to $12 to $13 billion, coming in at the higher end of the estimate after all. But things aren't looking great for GM in the long run. The company only beat expectations because analysts had set the bar low, expecting tariffs and EV cutbacks to hit profits harder. In reality, GM's third quarter revenue was flat compared to last year, and net income plunged 57%, down to $1.3 billion. This comes after a decade of GM continuously downsizing. By 2017, GM had sold its entire European division, handing Opel and Vauxhall over to France's PSA Group, the makers of Peugeot and Citroën. Defenders of GM's performance argue that the profit drop isn't as bad as it looks. It's mostly the result of heavy charges from the company's retreat from electric vehicles. That pullback came after new regulatory changes. With the EPA easing emission rules and EV tax credits being rolled back, GM expects to take a $1.6 billion hit in the first quarter of 2026. GM had actually been leading the charge in electrifying its fleet, inspired by the success of rival EV makers and boosted by the growing global incentives for greener transportation. So now it has the most to lose. Not to mention its recall problems are far from over. As recently as April 2025, GM had to recall over 721,000 SUVs and trucks globally. These cars had potential engine issues that could lead to a complete loss of power. Unsurprisingly, this led to crashes, so GM had to recall several car models manufactured between 2021 and 2024, which we guess is better than past practices of covering things up and not issuing a recall, but still not great. GM's downfall shows how even giants can crumble, but another American icon is facing the same fate. Watch The Real Reason McDonald's is Failing to see why the golden arches are starting to lose their shine, or click on this video instead.